Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, so today's episode of the show is brought to you by the letter C. And no, the letter C does not mean craft. I can't stand that word. It's just been so abused. I mean, for example, last week here in Nottingham we had a craft beer week, and everybody and their mother, you know, whether it was Joe Bloggs making beer in his garden shed or Brewdog, a craft. I mean, you know, which basically has rendered the word completely and utterly meaningless in reality. I mean, when you think about it, they're quite correct. I mean, the word craft essentially just means to make. So yes, basically Joe Bloggs is making beer in his garden shed, and Brewdog is making beer in their, you know, brewery in Scotland. You know, I mean, it's just scale, I suppose. But when people tend to use the term craft, they often mean small, independent, that kind of thing. So the reality is the word craft is just completely irrelevant now. I mean, you know, what's wrong with micro? You know, micro brewer, micro distiller, artisanal, those kind of terms, you know, they make a lot more sense. Whereas to me, this concept of craft is just, you know, doesn't at the end of the day. But anyway, so today's episode of the show is not brought to you by the term craft. The C, of course, refers to Canada, and you're probably thinking, well, hang on, we know Two Brewers or Yukon Brewing are based in Canada, in the Yukon, but hang on, WhistlePig, aren't they in Vermont? Isn't that in America? Indeed that is, but the obvious connection, if you didn't know it, is that WhistlePig obviously source Canadian rye. That is, well, I mean, the farm, it's actually a farm. I mean, you know, livestock and arable, and I think they even have maple trees and stuff like that, was founded in 2007 by an unpronounceable person's name, Raj P. Bhakta, I believe. And it, like I said, it's a farm, and then I believe they had this grand idea to buy some Canadian, or casks of Canadian rye, which I think at the time was about 8 years old, then mature them for a further couple of years in the States before bottling under their own label. And he brought in obviously some considerable talent, including Chief Blender Pete Lynch and the Master Distiller Dave Pickerel, who of course, as we know, sadly passed away in November of last year. Obviously Dave Pickerel was well renowned within the American whiskey industry. I believe made his name with Maker's Mark, and also worked with Metallica, I believe, on a project for them. I think that basically was sort of taking some casks and blaring Metallica at them, because apparently Sonics had something to do with the way it matured. Who knows? But anyway, so yeah, so going back to WhistlePig, so they imported you know, casks of 8 or 10 year old Canadian rye, which, you know, they whoever they purchased them from wasn't actually doing anything with, and obviously they released it as a 10-year-old, and they have also released, you know, this new World series, of which I've got a couple of samples to look at. So I think that'll be interesting. Different cask types, and we'll obviously talk about them when I look at the lineup. And apparently they're now obviously have created a distillery at the farm, and obviously they grow their own rye and what have you, and are producing another one of those horrible terms. What was it? Grain to glass. I mean, oh, again, you know, yes, all right, okay, technically yes, grain to glass. But everybody does that, you know, everybody takes grain and it ends up in a glass, you know. Again, meaningless terminology, which I'm afraid sort of both the distilling and the brewing industry does seem to be sort of full of, shall we say. But anyway, So I now believe that they are distilling their own rye, and I think they're now blending it in. I think they do a bottling called Farm Stock. I think they do another one called Boss Hog as well, which I don't believe I've tasted. But anyway, so that's a little bit about Whistlepig. Don't really need to say an awful lot about Yukon spirits or Two Brewers. As you well know, I've done episodes of the show on them before, and finally I've got a sample of their peated expression, which I'm really interested in looking at. They did kindly send me one last year, I think it was, but unfortunately it didn't sort of survive the postage. Now the interesting thing about Two Brewers is that they are winning buckets of medals, and picked up a whole host of them at the Canadian Whisky Awards, which were part of the Victoria Whisky Festival that was held in January. And talking of which, out of the blue a couple of weeks ago, I received an email from Lawrence that does the Whisky Intelligence website, and not kindly puts my videos up on there, and unbeknown to me, Lawrence is part of, or the head honcho of the actual event, and has kindly invited me to the one in next January. So, you know, incredibly generous. So, you know, if you're watching in Canada and you're going to go to the festival, then I may well bump into you there. Hopefully I won't be too jet lagged. I mean, it's a long way from here to Canada. But anyway, so what I love about Two Brewers is, obviously not being Scottish, they have the ability to play around with, you know, all different types of barley, rye, wheat, all these different types of grain. But not only do they use different malting levels, which is pretty much unheard of in whiskey terms anyway. In brewing terms, of course, obviously, you know, it's a staple, you know, of using different roasts, and so their standard is a pale malt, like, you know, everybody tends to use, but then, you know, they use different roastings, and the innovative bottling number 14 that I've got here is going to be really interesting, because it is made up of the use of these roasted malts. So yeah, it's going to be hopefully a really interesting tasting this afternoon. So let's just take a look at that.
The blood red sky, the rain of day is over.
Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with release number 13 from Two Brewers. This is, like I said, this is called the Classic. It's, you know, made with pale malt and pretty much, you know, standard sort of, you know, double distillation, all that kind of thing, and so that will be our starting point. Next bottling we'll be looking at is number 14, the innovative. This is bottled at 43%, and apparently the mash is 64% roasted malts, of which that's, I think, from what I can work out from what the information I was sent, 20% of that 64% was black and chocolate malt, so heavily toasted. Don't know whether they use any rye in it or not, I can't remember, but we'll find out when we get to it. Right, then we're going to move on to two of the Whistlepig bottlings. The first one is 12-year-old Straight Rye. This is part of their Old World series and was finished in Sauternes casks. Now, for some reason they decided that they were going to, why not finish, you know, rye being finished in different casks, why not? Could be really interesting. I believe they've done a port finish, obviously the Sauternes, and I think they've done a Madeira finish as well, as, like I said, so this was bottled at 45%. The second bottling is now the current Old World cask finish bottling, which is available at the moment, a bottle at 42%, and this is the combination of all of those three different cask finishes. So it's 7% ex-port, 23% ex-Sauternes, and 70% ex-Madeira. So yeah, it could be really interesting, and yeah, so looking forward to that. And finally, a bit of peat, and why not? So this is release number 12 from Two Brewers, and I believe it's just the classic, but obviously you know, pale malt, but peated. So should be really interesting. So there you go. That's today's little lineup. Let's kick off with a bit of classic then, shall we? Okay, so let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? Whenever I smell this, it just reminds me of Macmyra. It is wonderfully estery. I'm getting sort of pineapples, apricot, apple, banana. I mean, that is just a beautiful nose. I mean, I love my whiskey to be really fruity and to sort of, like, you know, stick it on the line. But it's not blousy. There is a sort of a citric element and a touch of almost minerality, which kind of balances that up. There's a little bit of honey, a little bit of oak as well, not a huge amount. And the oak adds on a little bit of spice, sort of slightly sweeter, almost cinnamony sort of spice. And it's just such a lovely, voluptuous nose, and you can see why this wins prizes, because it's absolutely gorgeous. Let's see what the palate like. Big, juicy, full, fruity, white fruits, a little bubble gummy, it has to be said, but I really like that. Apricot, apple. There's a grip to it as well, which could well come from the oak. It's possibly a sort of slight oak grip, but I'm wondering whether there is a little rye in there. It's just got that feeling. I could well be wrong. The oak is more noticeable on the finish. You certainly get the charred oak coming through, but the fruit just kind of lingers, but it's kind of pushed more towards the edges of the mouth, and the sort of like the charred oak and the spices sort of, again, sweet spices kind of come through on the finish. So it's just a beautiful whiskey. It is a sort of whiskey that I really, really enjoy drinking, because there's no harshness, there's no roughness, there's no faintiness, you know. It is just an all-round gorgeous whiskey. Right, okay, so let's move on to number 14. This is the innovative, and no putty cat, you're not going on there. Right, let's see what the nose gives us. I mean, you really can smell the chocolate malt. It is roasted and toasty and chocolatey, quite grainy. There's a heavy oiliness as well, and again, I'm pretty certain I can get some rye-like notes coming through as well. A little bit of digestive biscuit, touch of honey. It's a lot less exuberant in its fruitiness, and that's obviously what using the heavier roasted malt is doing to this nose. It's less floating my boat than the classic. I mean, it is really interesting. It's really intriguing. Again, really clean, really well put together. It's possibly got a little youthfulness, that sort of oily, youthful kind of character. Yeah, really intriguing. But like I said, I think the classic is just you know, like I said, really floats my boat. So see what the part's like. Earthy, oily, again plenty of roasted malt. I'm definitely getting some rye coming through now with that sort of slightly spicy, oily kind of character. It's a bit young. There is a sort of, not quite a sort of like a mar note on the finish, but there's definitely a youthful spirit note that kind of comes through. There's a little estery fruit that's just kind of hinting at it. It's just below the surface, but that sort of roasted malt intensity kind of like just lingers sort of right the way through it. And yeah, it is innovative. It's really interesting. It's really chewy and it's really malty and it's dark and it's toasted, and you know, I mean, I like a good dark beer, but I'm missing the fruit of the classic, which is just, to me, was just absolutely gorgeous. This I'm kind of less enamoured by, but I think sort of like from a sort of, you know, a technical angle, I think this is a really interesting whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old Sauternes finish. Let's see what nose gives us on this end, shall we? Big, fat, rich, lots of sweet, dried apricot, sweet honey, but beneath there's that sort of vibrant rye note that sort of stops it becoming overly flabby and sort of overly honeyed. It's, you could argue it is a little simplistic, but I mean, it really delivers. I mean, you know, it is a big, powerful nose, and I think this is the thing with rye. Rye seems to have a lot more personality, a lot more character, and seems to stand up to sort of, you know, cask finishing really quite adroitly. And it's just, it's lovely. I mean, there's no off notes, no dirtiness, no, you know, this has really been well put together. So let's see what the palate like. Again, a lot of late harvested winey Sauternes character up front. Big, oily, rich, bourbony notes. Almost corn, fat corn-like notes. But then the rye does kind of like slip through, just slightly under the radar. I get that sort of slight spiciness, a little bit of edginess. It's a little short. But you know, the Sauternes notes kind of linger, the honey kind of lingers quite nicely, and the spices kind of nibble at the edge of the tongue. So yeah, I mean, it's nice, it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to sort of say it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It is what it is, and I'd like to have seen a little more complexity and a little bit more length, if I'm being sort of like, you know, really critical, but you know, it's still a really nice whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the combination of the three different cask types. So this is the old world cask finish. Now this is far more interesting, I think. I'm kicking off a lot more rye, dark rye, rye bread, spice. The rye is certainly more prominent, which is what I want. there's a little bit of dried fruit, a little biscuitiness, there's a little bit of the Madeira kind of coming through with that sort of, you know, slight oxidised fruit note. Not getting a huge amount of the port. The Sauternes again is adding a little bit of sweetness, but the rye is a lot more intense and a lot more balancing. The Sauternes is adding more of a kind of sort of waxy apricot and orange kind of note. And all told, I think this is far, far more interesting and far more complex. It's just an absolutely gorgeous nose. And also has that, it seems to come across as a lot older as well, but then it's not kind of like, you know, a big waft of Sauternes honey. It's more focused on the rye, should we say, with the casks kind of, you know, adding nuances, which is, in my opinion, how it should be. Let's see what it tastes like. Quite a dry finish. It opens up with a little bit more of the cask, so I'm getting a little bit more of the sort of Sauternes and the sort of, you know, the honey and the oxidised biscuity Madeira character. The rye kind of has to fight a little bit to kind of get through, but it comes through quite nicely. More oilier rye character on the palate than the nose would suggest, and less spices. Hints of vanilla, a little bit of spice comes through right on the finish. I mean, it's got a lovely fullness to it, has to be said. I think the nose is a little bit more interesting. I don't get a huge amount from the port, but then there's only 7% of the casks were port casks, and maybe there's a sort of an intimation of kind of red fruits, but I'm not getting a huge amount from that. I did have a look online to see what this was currently retailing for, and it's 145 quid, which, when you think about it, for a 12-year-old is very, very expensive. And I suppose the question is it worth it? And yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether I would want to pay £145 for it. I thought the nose was absolutely gorgeous. I wasn't quite so there with the palate. It was interesting. But £145? I think that's a little bit much. Right, okay, so let's have a bit of peat then. So really looking forward to this, as I didn't get the chance to taste it the last time round. So let's have a look and see what the nose gives us. Earthy, manure-y. Really violety. Yeah, loads of violet. It's kind of like, you know, a supercharged Bamor, if you like. Really nicely balanced. Underneath all of that, I'm getting the estery fruit. It's just certainly not one-dimensional. This is not just all about the peat, but I'm certainly getting the pineapple, the apricot, the character of the classic. It's got a little bit of honey, a little bit of, you know, almost kind of Weetabixy sort of notes. It's sort of, yes, it's got that sort of slight youthfulness, but I think the classic is just, you know, so gorgeously fruity that it just gets away with it. And you know, this certainly has got an absolutely superb balance. It has to be said. Let's see what the past like. A lovely juicy finish, full, chewy. It's a touch lighter on the palate. It's less about the peat. It's still quite violety, but it's more about the classic character kind of coming through, the estery fruits. The peat is maybe not quite so violety and not quite so manure. It's a little bit more drier, but it's still juicy and fruity. The length is incredibly good. Apricots and a little bit of honey on the finish. That is absolutely fantastic. That is absolutely gorgeous. I really like that. It's just the two work together so amazingly well. Sometimes with these sort of big estuary fruity whiskies that do get that are peated, they kind of don't work together particularly well. The peat kind of sometimes feels a little bit at odds with the big fruit, but certainly on this, it works really well. Doesn't it, Buddy Cat? Right, okay, so let's sum this week's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Two Brewers for continuing to sort of send me samples all the way from Canada, which can't be cheap. That is just sort of really appreciated. Also, thank you to WhistlePig's distributors in the UK, Axiom Brands, I think, for the sample of the Old World cask. And obviously the other sample came from, I think it was a Whiskey Magazine tasting, I believe. Anyway, so just possibly my favourite whiskey of the tasting is the Classic. I mean, it is just absolutely gorgeous. It's everything that I want in a whiskey. It's big, it's fruity, it's exuberant, but it's balanced. It's not blousy, and it is just an absolute joy to drink. The innovative, innovative. It really is. It's really interesting. It's I'm not quite as sort of find it as favourable as the Classic, but certainly I love all that sort of dark roasted kind of character. It is really unusual, and I must admit, I've not come across anything quite like it. So hats off. It's really interesting. The WhistlePig Sauternes finish, I mean, not bad at all. Again, really clean, maybe a little bit simple, maybe a little bit too much of the Sauternes cask, and not enough of the rye in reality. But again, not a bad whiskey at all. The Old World cask, which now I thought that was considerably better. It was more interesting than the Sauternes finish. There was more emphasis on the rye. There was more complexity, and it was overall, had a slightly better balance for me. So that I thought was very good. And the peated Two Brewers, absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I did wonder how peat would work with their spirit, whether they would essentially make a sort of a peated Classic version, which they have done, and if they did, how the peat would work with such an estuary spirit. But it's worked really nicely in my opinion, so absolutely spot on. And I guess one of these days somebody will start importing them into the UK, and those of you that watch in the UK, hopefully you'll get the opportunity to try them, because I think they are just really interesting, distillery. So nice to see them continually winning awards. So there you go. That's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. So all that's left to say is good afternoon and good ramming. Right, actually, we haven't quite finished yet. I'm going to put my hands up and say I made a bit of a cock up. Now, when I put the episode of the show together, I thought I knew I had a sample of the 10-year-old WhistlePig 10-year-old rye, and obviously I'd done the title page with that on and all that kind of stuff. And when I got samples together, I'm thinking, where's it gone? And I thought, I don't remember finding the sample of the Sauternes cask, and I'm thinking, oh bugger, I've made a bit of a cock up here. I'm going to have to go back and change the picture and what have you. and just something in the back of my mind was just going, oh, you've got a sample of the 10-year-old. Well, I have got a sample of the 10-year-old. So look, I mean, I could have kind of redone the show from scratch to a certain extent and slipped it in and no one would have noticed and all that kind of thing, but obviously I can't really do that, so I'm just going to have to basically say, look, I'm sorry, I've cocked up. I'm now going to taste the 10-year-old straight rye. So this is kind of like where it all sort of started, and I wish I'd actually put it in with the actual lineup, but you know, these things have a tendency to happen, don't they? Anyway, let's see what the nose gives us. Classic rye. Quite chunky on the oak, but sort of nice and spicy. It's got that lovely sort of column still dried fruit. And it's just got a gorgeous spiciness. I mean, this is just absolutely stunning. I mean, I don't know where WhistlePig purchased their stocks of rye from. I mean, there are not too many distilleries in Canada that have been going for ever and a year, I suppose. Well, no, that's probably wrong. No, let's start that again. Hang on a minute. We haven't actually quite finished. I'm going to put my hands up and say I've cocked up. It does happen. When I originally decided I was going to do this episode show, I thought, I know I've got a sample of the WhistlePig 10-year-old Straight Rye, and obviously I'd made the title page with that on and figured out my tasting order and all that kind of thing. And then when I just put the samples down this afternoon, I suddenly thought, hang on, where's the 10-year-old? What? I've got a 15-year-old Sauternes, or the 12-year-old Sauternes. Ooh. And just something in the back of my mind was saying, I know I've got a sample of the straight 10-year-old rye, and I have, and I thought, well, I could have, you know, sort of rejigged and sort of reshot the tail end of the episode, but I just thought, no, I'm just going to say I made a cock up, and I'm going to shoehorn this in at the end because you know I had to put it in sort of earlier, but anyway. So the 10-year-old WhistlePig Straight Rye. Let's see what the nose gives us. Lovely pungency, lovely intensity of that sort of column still dried fruits. Touch of spice, a little bit of oily sort of rye, sort of American oak, quite chunky oak in actual fact, but it's well behaved. It's kind of sat beneath the rye kind of character. A little bit of toasted almond, a little bit of wood spice. I mean, that is just classic rye whiskey, and it's got intensity but subtlety. And you know what? That's a lovely nose. Let's see what the palate's like. Whoa, that's intense. That's rye. Dark rye, rye bread. Intense spices, earth, little bit of oak, not quite so chunky the oak, it's a little bit more reserved, still quite nutty, quite toasty, really earthy. I mean, this was bottled at 50%. There's a touch of rose petal on the finish. I often tend to find that with rye, even if it has a reasonable amount of age to it, it still seems to retain that sort of slightly Mari-like character for, you know, quite some considerable number of years. But the intensity on that is absolutely stunning, and it is, you know, I think you can pick that up for about 45 quid a bottle, which to me is really reasonable. Well, I think it's about 45 quid a bottle. It's a lot less than the other one, shall we say, the old world cask, and I love that. That's really impressive. So so yeah, apologies for the cock up, and well, You can go now.
Lost in the rice that shine with mystery. Lost